My training was really about naming the problem. And it was really pretty much, as a neurologist, diagnose and adios, meaning here's your problem. Good luck with that. And
Mhm,
I just was really very frustrated by that. Not only because in that regard, you're not really helping people, but
mhm,
ultimately, if there is any intervention, it's to treat symptoms of the disease, pain pills for headaches, etc.
mhm,
It was never to identify the cause. So we were very much treating the smoke and ignoring the fire.
mhm,
And when I began to get my arms around that, in Western cultures, we're pretty much told, you do whatever you want, live your life however you choose. And when you have a problem like diabetes or your cognitive decline is obvious or you have heart disease, we'll fix it with our magic pills. Well, that
mhm,
doesn't really work very well. And so we have to be very preemptive and we have to identify what's causing inflammation, what is increasing the action of what are called free radicals, what is paving the way for these problems. And certainly nutrition and other lifestyle issues like sleep and exercise and stress and getting into nature are all extremely valuable tools in the toolbox. They are levers that we can pull in order to really change our health destiny, not only as it relates to the brain, my goodness, but
mhm,
even as it relates to our chances of having a good or bad outcome as it relates to COVID infection. We're in
mhm,
charge of that. It's not the luck of a draw. Let's just say that we have two major centers in the brain that are involved in decision making. One more primitive area called the amygdala is the area that responds impulsively, immediately, in terms of what we decide to do. It wants to do whatever it wants to do now. The rest of the world be damned. As contrasted to another area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is behind your forehead. One third of the brain's cortex is this prefrontal cortex. It brings in lots of other relevant information as it relates to our decision making. And it really is the adult in the room. It exercises control over the amygdala, control over the more primitive area that says, I want to do it now. The problem is that there's a connection between this prefrontal cortex controlling, then through top down control, the more primitive area. That connection is incredibly important. When you reduce that connection, then the amygdala gets its way. Then we become more impulsive. We make decisions that are not thought out, that have no concept of what it's going to be like for our future self, much less how it affects other people, how it affects the planet, meaning that we lose the sense of empathy and compassion. That pathway, that connection between those two areas is threatened by something called inflammation, the
mhm,
underpinning of coronary artery disease, of type 2 diabetes, of Alzheimer's. We live in a world that's very inflammatory, that's increasing the amount of inflammation in our bodies. Everyone's heard in COVID this thing called the cytokine storm, where suddenly there's this incredible uptick of inflammation in the human body that goes around destroying things like the lungs and the brain and the heart. All kinds of things get damaged by these chemicals. But at the same time, as Dr. Bredesen has pointed out, we have what is called the cytokine, not storm, but the cytokine drizzle, meaning
mhm,
just a little uptick in the amount of cytokines that are produced, but over a long period of time that can similarly cause damage. Dr. Bredesen talks about the cytokine storm in the context of Alzheimer's. And what we talked about in our last book called Brainwash is how inflammation over time damages that connection, takes the adult out of the room, the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, so that our decision making is hijacked and we are left to being, guided by the desires of this 8-year-old that wants everything now, that wants everything for himself or herself, and loses the sense of acting in a way that's beneficial, not just to self, but to others, which is so incredibly valuable, especially today. The standard American diet, which has now become the Western diet, which has now become the global diet,
mhm,
is a very pro-inflammatory diet. These, highly modified processed foods that are global is
mhm,
very pro-inflammatory. So in a very real sense, these global changes in nutrition through increasing inflammation are changing how people globally are making decisions. It's locking people into self and away from a sense of connectedness. We have to consciously make some decisions right now to reestablish our connection to the adult in the room. That would be, even for a couple of nights, do everything you can to get a better night's sleep. To maybe say today or tomorrow, I'm going to make it a point to spend 20 to 30 minutes each day outside in nature and leave
Mhm.
my smartphone at home. You can say, I'm going to meditate for 20 minutes a day.
Mhm.
And that will then help you regain the tools to make better food decisions. That's probably the most difficult place to go because the primitive brain is screaming at you day in and day out to give it sweet,
Mhm.
because that's a survival mechanism that we've inherited from our ancestors. It told us that the food we are eating now, because it has sugar in it, was safe and would help us survive during times of winter, caloric scarcity. The
Mhm.
problem is that, now we can get sweet every day and it's targeting survival mechanisms that now are inappropriate. So it is what we call this evolutionary environmental mismatch. We would seek out the ripened fruit during our hunter gatherer days or even before as primates, would give us fructose, a fruit sugar. And fructose tells the body, get ready, winter is coming. And through the turning on of the production of a chemical called uric acid, then fructose signals the body to make fat, to increase its ability to store water, to increase its ability to make blood sugar to power the brain. So we can be smart enough to avoid the two things that killed our ancestors: starvation and predation. The problem is that now we're turning on that mechanism, that survival mechanism, day in and day out. And it thinks that we need to make fat and raise our blood sugar as a means of survival. And we see how it's playing out: diabetes, obesity, elevated blood pressure, these metabolic issues as a consequence of triggering that mechanism and turning on in the body production of uric acid. So we
Mhm.
knew that uric acid was elevated in diabetes and in obesity and high blood pressure, but we sort of said, well, that's cool. It happens to be elevated, interesting, but if you don't have gout, who cares?
Mhm.
Now we know that it's actually involved in causing these problems through the very mechanism that we just talked about. The reason that uric acid now is so high on the list is because it sets the stage for the elevated blood sugar and the
Mhm.
elevated blood pressure, and certainly the obesity and ultimately the insulin resistance and the diabetes that are powerful players. Metabolic diseases are under our control. We can make choices to rein in our metabolic mayhem, regain metabolic health, and therefore really put an end or at least dramatically lower our risk for the number one causes of death on planet Earth. The tools are there. Know your blood sugar. In an ideal world, you could know your blood sugar day in and day out by wearing what's called a continuous glucose monitor. Know
Mhm.
your uric acid level. You can go to the doctor and have it checked, or you can buy a home monitor online and know your uric acid level right now and in an hour if you want to. Get your body weight under control. Here are the tools to make that happen. Most importantly, I think fundamentally is to recognize that we are experiencing the manifestation of targeting our DNA, targeting our genetic legacy with information that it can't use, that it is corrupting, that our
Mhm.
gene expression is being changed by our modern world, by the food choices we are making, the lack of sleep, the lack of exercise. Believe it or not, these are changing our gene expression.